I think Leslie's going to join us. Hi. You? Good. How are you?
Hi, I'm Eddie Feinstein.
I've seen you around once or twice.
And it was cold. It was like
Actually,
cold.
so-
I feel better today.
It was 72.
72 when we were, but yeah, I was taking it, of course.
You know what we really need to do? We need to eliminate some of these training requirements.
Really?
Yeah, I just want to put that
We
in
need
the
to
head.
eliminate some of these meetings. That's what we really need.
Yeah. The mandate.
Wait, how-
Meetings in general.
So we have to
Meetings
clean
in
somebody's
general.
office, maybe?
Yeah. Or prepare for a.
Have you seen your office?
Or find a. Or find a
I'm
Friday-
Zoom.
No, you ought to see it in person. It's even worse.
Or find a Friday morning speaker with, we're all set, by the way.
We are.
We are all set.
Good. MIT?
IT,
Good.
AI.
Excellent. Excellent. Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see all of you and to see the people online as well. And so it's been a while. I apologize for you having to miss the October meeting. I had COVID. So we were unable to do it at that point. I wanted Andy just to take the meeting over, but he said,
I need Fran.
I'll wait, but at any rate, we're back together again, and we have some new members of our task force, and so I'd like us to go around the table again, if you don't mind, and we'll also include the people that are online, and just introduce yourselves and one sentence about who you represent, okay? We'll start with Patrice.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Patrice McCarthy. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel for the Connecticut Association of Boards of Education.
Donna Carnell, Meredith Schools. I'm filling in for Michael Grove today.
Thank you for filling in for Michael.
Morning, everybody. Karen Helene, your Director of Benjamin School and representing CAPSA.
Hi, Heather Tartaglia, Chief Program Officer at CRAC, representing the Rest Alliance.
Hi, Catherine Meyer. I'm an attorney at the Center for Children's Advocacy. Been a mostly special education attorney for about 15 years, and I'm currently the Director of our Medical Legal Partnership at the Yale Child Study Center.
Welcome.
Tiffany Jackson, Executive Director of Student Services Special Education for New Haven Public Schools.
Welcome, Tiffany.
Hi, Jennifer Lucier, and I'm representing the Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center and the Parent Committee Information Center.
Great.
Stephanie Wanzer. I'm a special ed teacher for 18 through 22-year-olds at ARREST at CES, and also here representing CEA.
Sarah Flaherty, I'm here as a parent, but I'm also a regular teacher at Chicago, high school math teacher and secretary of CEA.
Good morning, I'm Nicole O'Connell. I'm the Director of Special Services in Naugatuck. I'm representing Concase. I'm the president-elect, and I'm stepping in for Amy Turner today.
Morning, everyone. I'm Brian Cookowitz. I'm the Special Education Division Director for the Bureau of Special Education, representing the Connecticut State Department of Education.
Online.
Well, you want to introduce yourself, Fran?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Fran Rabinowitz. I am the Executive Director for Connecticut Superintendents, former superintendent in Hamden and in Bridgeport, and I also work at the State Department of Education.
Well, I'm Andy Feinstein. I'm a lawyer in private practice in Mystic and legislative chair of special education equity for kids in Connecticut. And I co-chair this with Brian.
Okay, online. Let me see.
Susan first.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, hi, I'm Susan Yankee, and I'm Chair and Parent Member of the Connecticut State Advisory Council for Special Education. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Keith, is that, or Kevin? Kevin.
Kevin.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kevin Keating. I am the Pupil Services Director here at ACES RESC. Thanks for having me. Hi, Fran.
Hello, how are you, Kevin?
Good, how are you? Glad you're
Uh,
feeling better.
Kathy, I thought you were gone.
I'm never gone, Andy. Going up. Kathy Gabrielson, I am the Director of Pupil Services for Stafford Public Schools. I'm the immediate past, present, and con case, and I'm here as part of the public.
And Megan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Megan Poganowski. I'm the Director of Special Education in Oxford.
Okay, and Alicia, I think we know. Hi, Alicia.
Alicia?
Alicia Bowman, Associate Executive Director for the Connecticut Association of Schools. Good morning.
Morning. And Leslie.
Good morning, everyone. Leslie Torres Rodriguez, Superintendent, Hartford Public Schools.
Welcome to all our new members.
And we have two folks from CEA here to introduce themselves.
Sure. Lou Rossetto Birch, Legislative Coordinator at CEA.
Hi, Louis.
Thank you. And I'm Orlando Rodriguez with CEA and I'm a policy.
Good to see you all.
Thank you.
And we have Rosalie Philippon, who from the legislature, who is recording and also live streaming all of this. She manages the entire process, along with my wonderful assistant, Dawn Cole, who sends you the findings and all of the updates every month. So I thought, you know.
Let me, so we have a report due January 1st, which is soon. And it's supposed to be findings, it's not supposed to be recommendations. And so our purpose is to try to arrive at certain findings and kind of cull down what our priorities are going to be for next year. And that's the purpose of today's meeting. The other thing to keep in mind, however, is that the legislation established 9 areas that we were supposed to look at. And in some of those areas we've done some work, and some other areas we haven't done some work. And so I think it's probably incumbent upon us to at least address those areas. Okay.
So what I wanted to impress on everyone, as everyone had the findings. Oh, okay, Tiff.
I'll have it for you.
Thank you.
Okay. Sure. Anybody else?
You
need?
need to-
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Sure. Yeah, no.
Just said, I thought it was yours.
So I want to begin by saying that while Andy and I, am again repeating, while we co-chair this task force, our job, as I see it, is to facilitate the discussion of the task force and to facilitate the final outcomes of the task force. We are one voice each on the task force. This is yours. And I hope that we continue to make that clear, that it is your task force. Whatever we come up with as the findings that will later become recommendations need to be yours. And I would hope that we're not going to put something forward, anything forward, that falls in the 5 categories, so to speak. The category that says, I can't live with this at all. And I prefer if we don't have any 4s and 5s, that we can come to consensus on the findings that need to go forward. This is a list of the findings that I received to date. I actually received recommendations because thank you to Stephanie. I didn't quite read the legislation as closely as I should have, and thought that recommendations were due in January of 24. I was really relieved to find out that they're just findings so that we can work together with our new members of the task force to move forward to the area of recommendations. And the findings are one thing, we can change those, move those, whatever. But the final report in January of 2025 is going to be the one that I think is going to make all the difference in the world. Andy, you want to add anything?
No, but I do think the example of that is on the issue of caseloads for special ed teachers, where the finding is going to, I think, well, I'm not speaking for everybody, but at least from my point of view, clearly that's an issue that's a serious issue about the overwork of special ed teachers and about limiting their caseloads. The actual recommendation, I think it's a much more complicated task, and that's next year's one.
So, the first thing I wanted to begin with, if we can, is you received the draft findings, and thank you for your patience in my taking the recommendations and rewording them to findings, and then you're editing them and being able to move them forward. Are there any additional findings that you want to bring to the table today? And it doesn't have to be right now. I mean, we can do it at the end after we start to prioritize.
So I know I haven't, this is literally my first day here, but just something to consider. I wasn't a part of the funding subcommittee, but this really impacts large urban districts. And as we're looking at funding, we're setting kind of the stage. Moving forward is really looking at special education funding as it relates to charter schools and open employees. Those kinds of things we have to consider because it's a huge burden significantly on the large urban districts. So I think that's something that needs to be included in some of the information around funding.
Open choice and charter.
Right, which the department is in the process of at least doing a ruling on.
Well,
clarification.
Okay.
I also think at the end, we want to go over the list of what's in the legislation and see whether we want to say anything about any of those.
So I think that anybody else, any additional findings, and we may go through all this and you may find it at 11:25 that there's something more that you want to add. And I want you to be able, we both want you to be able to do that. Do you need any time to look these over again? You want to take a few minutes?
Clarification.
Sure.
And I sincerely apologize. I just want to make sure that I'm clear on the process. After today, will we have opportunities to take these back to the stakeholders that we're representing to get feedback from them? Or is the idea that today we're coming up with kind of the findings that we want to move forward?
Well, we only have one more meeting on December 12th. So if possible, my hope is that the findings that are here represent the stakeholders that you represent. You know, we had 3 subcommittees, you know, funding, eligibility, and services. My hope is that the representatives represented the views, but you can certainly bring back the findings. And if there are huge discomfort with them or whatever, we'll be open to hear it. We're just very aware of our January 1st. And thank goodness Andy is an attorney and a prolific writer and an excellent writer. So he's already agreed to put the report forward. So,
well, and I think that's the process, that after we complete our work today,
yeah,
I will put together a draft report, which will then be the subject of our meeting in December. You know, to the extent that the findings are misstated, overstated, understated in that report, we'll have an opportunity to then make changes to more accurately reflect the will of the task force.
It would be permissible for me to share.
of course,
Thank you.
Nicole, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank
yes, yeah, not, we would encourage you
Thank
to.
you.
Okay, so this is not gonna be easy, guys, because I don't think we can bring forth every priority or every finding that's here. I mean, Andy and I talked, we thought if we ought to have 5 major findings, if you wanna go more than that, we can. It's just that I don't know how much the legislature can take in. And the other thing is, one of the things that isn't here that I do have a concern about, it may have come in at the last minute, I've got to remember again, but seclusion and restraint are certainly huge. And that will need to be a finding, and I told you we had Columbia doing research on that, and they continue to do the research. But I can't imagine that we wouldn't have that as a finding.
Fran, sorry, I can't figure out where my hand button is for some reason on my computer today.
Oh, sorry, it's okay.
No, that's okay, because the SAC is working on restraint and seclusion, and we had a work group yesterday on it. So Jennifer, do you think that we could, when would you need our findings by? Because we're going to have another work group, and I'm hoping one of our subcommittee groups will work on it, but we have some findings and recommendations, but.
Well, we're not ready for the recommendations.
Okay.
The finding would certainly be that restraint and seclusion, I don't know the wording, but certainly is an area that the task force will be investigating and making recommendations on.
Okay.
What?
It's under the subgroup of eligibility.
I thought so. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Because we do have a list of weaknesses that we've come up with, findings.
Yeah.
So I didn't know when you would like that shared or through our subcommittee. When's your cutoff date, Andy, for when you need the information?
Andy, you can answer that because you're going to be writing the report.
Well, I mean, the cutoff date is New Year's Eve, but the idea is to write something between now and the December meeting, and then we can amend it at that point.
And I think, but to your point, Chris, just to clarify, I think what you're saying is that it will certainly be a finding that restraint and seclusion is something we'll investigate further and make recommendations on as a topic, but that can happen post January 1st. So we don't need to get recommendations from other groups or other stakeholder groups, just knowing that we're going to place it on as one of the findings and further develop that, because I think there's going to be probably a lot of stakeholder voices we're going to need to get around that.
Absolutely. And, Andy just showed me a text from one of our co-chairs of the education committee who was very interested in this. And he said we could feel free to offer recommendations on the January report if we saw fit. I'm not sure we'll be ready to do that, but if we are, I'll certainly include recommendations. But on seclusion and restraint, I'm not sure that we have enough time to get everyone's perspective and all the research in the room for such a large topic to make specific recommendations in December. Can we have consensus on that? Okay.
Well, the one dissenting voice might be the chairman of the education committee who really would like us to work out a consensus on that so the legislation can pass next year. Exactly. I don't think so. I don't think so either. I'm saying that they would like that.
Well, thank you, task force, because I don't think we are prepared to do that as quickly. That really has to be well thought out. I mean, we all have our own perspective on it, but even just hearing different things around the nation and what is happening around the nation, I realize I have a lot to learn. So, yes.
We move to another issue about this, which is we ought to specify areas that are, important to this area that we're not going to cover. And I think one of those is exclusionary discipline, because there are lots of other organizations, other task forces working on those issues. And so we've got to decide whether that's what, clearly the suspension and expulsion of kids with disabilities is a very serious issue. And so we really ought to decide whether we want to, you know, claim that area or whether we want to leave that to others. That's one of those areas. A second area like that, perhaps, you know, is clearly the biggest thing we've heard about in special education over the last year is CT SEDS. Do we want to say anything about that, or do we want to suggest that you know, as people become more familiar with the system, the problems that we saw this past year are likely to dissipate? So those are two questions, two sort of general jurisdictional questions, which we really ought to decide in advance.
Andy, I have.
Andy, sorry, this is Susan. And in our discussions with restraint and seclusion, we also brought up CT SEDS because part of CT SEDS is how it's reported. And so a lot of this ties together. Meaning we're discussing things like just putting a note in a backpack because that's one of the checklists. And so they're kind of intertwined for different topics that we're using. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, no, that's very helpful.
And we had Catherine and Stephanie both.
Catherine.
Also new, thanks for having me. And so my vantage point is I represent parents who are low-income parents, many of whom have language access, language barrier issues, you know, all different kinds of barriers that are inherent. So one thing I want to Andy's point, before I bring my extra points in, I know the way it'll be drafted is that this is not dispositive of every problem that we've ever seen in special education in this state, right? So I think that people are careful because we're skirting around that we don't want to not acknowledge something and, you know, thereby saying that it's not a problem. So I trust this prolific writer, Andy, to figure out how to deal with that.
I'm sure I'll get plenty of advice from you, Catherine.
I mean, when she said attorney and prolific writer, I was like, I mean, he's that. But something I see not represented here is talking about, you know, the parent experience and the meaningful participation in the PPT process, which I think is probably the biggest issue I deal with on a daily basis. So language access is the obvious part of that. But overall, and this is again hard because this is a lot of it is relationship, right? And a lot of this is already in law, but to meaningfully participate, you need to understand what's going on. You need to have the ability to ask questions. You need to not, you know, be dismissed or stifled. You need to not be told that this meeting is 45 minutes and we're going to leave in 45 minutes, like the meeting I had yesterday. You need to, like parents need to, at the outset of the meeting, understand that they are part of the decision-making team. And just, you know, my quick example yesterday is that we were all waiting for, I was at a therapeutic school, and we're all waiting for the district to say whether or not we can do something. And I had to say 3 different times that we don't sit here and wait for the district to give a decision to us. We are the decision-making team. And in fact, school, you know the kids the best because you're with him every day, right? Along with the parents, obviously. So I don't know how to capture that, but I think it's really important, particularly as educators are more stressed and staffing, there's a shortage in staffing, that these, you know, more stress is going to impact the way meetings are run. And I think parents are really feeling that impact. That's one thing I want to say, sorry. And then the second thing I wanted to say, which we know a lot of us are also on the groups that are, you know, dealing with bullying, dealing with relational aggression, however we want to phrase that, that we need to also underscore the impact that bullying has on access to faith in, you know, in some way, or that would be my proposal. That, you know, we have an OCR letter from however many years ago that specifically says this, but we still have many, many PPTs where they say we're not talking about that here. That it's a huge problem because then the family again is not, you know, is prevented from saying this is how it's impacting my child's receiving their education and access to their services. And the last thing I'll say is about the suspension expulsion piece that you brought up, Andy, that of course we speak about ad nauseum in other groups. The staffing shortage has a huge impact for kids with disabilities in terms of exclusionary discipline, right? So kids being told they need to go home early because their parent is gone. So yes, that is an angle of exclusionary discipline, but that is specific perhaps to the folks that we're talking about here. Thank you for that.
I appreciate it.
Well,
Can you,
Stephanie was.
Catherine,
Yeah.
I just needed clarification.
Yeah, sure.
When you talked about, the bullying piece at the PPT, can you explain that again? They said that bullying could not be talked about?
Very, very often, even when I'm there, it is, this is, that's not a discussion for this meeting. Now, if I'm gonna play devil's advocate, right, like, the meeting is about program and services, but if bullying is impacting access to program and services, then it indeed is pertinent. Do we have to, I think what is a fair criticism is that we're not gonna, be the arbiter whether bullying happened or didn't happen.
Yep.
And there is supposed to be an investigation, there's, that's rife with other problems. But in terms of, there's a way to talk about it at a PPT that you can acknowledge whatever you need to acknowledge to have the discussion, right? We don't need to go back and forth with, facts and he said, she said at the PPT, fine. But we do need to say, acknowledge the parent, we understand this is your child's experience. And we understand, if we want to hear how it's impacting their ability to receive their education.
Okay, thank you. That's fair.
And again, it's federally government. You could bring it with you to the PPT if you have to.
I think it's Stephanie next and then Tiffany.
Steph, and Leslie, yes, I don't know who's.
Sorry. Sure. Okay, thank you.
I'm Heather.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
You're all set?
Yeah,
That's Heather.
Gibson.
Oh, Heather, I'm sorry. Heather.
I was gonna comment earlier, Andy, when you brought up CT said that I thought we had decided kind of early on in this, that CT, we weren't taking on CT said as part of the task force, that there may be associations with certain findings, like the restraint and seclusion issue that was brought up, but that I thought that was kind of one of the early agreements we had come to, that that's a whole, its own can of worms.
Let's reaffirm that if that is our position.
Yeah, Andy and I spoke about that yesterday and said we weren't we had agreed on that. I do think that it may come up as a subcategory under shortage of staff or whatever. But yes, I thought we had agreed that that would not be a major.
Tiffany, then Leslie.
So what I was just thinking about, and you guys may have done this, early on in task force, is really looking at kind of the point and purpose of why we're here. And I'm thinking about and reacting to a couple of different things. A couple of things that Attorney Meyer talked about with low income. And again, part of my purpose of being here is making sure to lift voices for large urban districts and some of the inequities that we see in funding, as I mentioned earlier. But the second is really looking at what we see that's happening in education and making sure that, again, we're looking at teacher burnout, teacher shortage, all of these things that really lead to the fact of us not being able to provide adequate service if we don't take care of that. I'm hoping that through our findings, there's something that we have in here that's going to really speak to the actual teacher experience right now to make sure that we have the staffing available enough to be able to manage. So I saw some subcategories that looked at things like, like the compliance, the level of compliance, or, things on caseload, things of that sort. So I just think that this is great that we're doing all these other things, but if we don't have a teaching force to teach folks, then all of these other things go out the window. So I'm just hoping that there's something that really speaks to the teacher experience enough to be able to make sure that we have a lasting teacher force in that group, if we have an opportunity that our task force is able to acknowledge that. That's it.
Well, there's been a lot of discussion about that. That's got
Starting point.
to be a major trope.
It's a major.
Leslie.
Yeah, I had a wondering, and as I look across the findings, I see reference subtly to cultural responsiveness. So I wondered the opportunity to be more explicit about, explicit about cultural competence and the role in over identification of special education students, right? Because we know that understanding diverse backgrounds helps all of us as educators recognize those variations in learning styles and behavior. And without that, right, there's a risk, which many of us know, of misrepresenting cultural norms as indicators of disabilities. And then the piece around bias, which we know can also contribute to the over-identification And then I did hear, and I appreciate the reference to the lack of access given linguistic differences. But we know that also plays in, right, the over-identification. And so to the extent that we can make the implicit a little more explicit in the recommendations, is something that is standing out for me. And then I did hear the reference earlier around the choice implication, the ecosystem of school choice. And so I just wanted to kind of +1 on that one, given that, right, Hartford is the district that, you know, pays the largest amount to providers without there being, you know, much regulation and significant variance in the charges for the same services.
Thank you, Leslie. So let's begin, and all of those additions are wonderful and they will be on the table. Could I begin by asking, are there any 5s on the findings? Was
On the
anyone
subcommittee findings or on the personal findings?
on all?
So-
Yes. Okay,
Yeah.
well, let's begin there.
Well, shouldn't we start with the subcommittee findings and then,
What?
shouldn't we start with the subcommittee findings? Because
Yeah,
those
why don't
are-
well, that's true. Let's start with the, you know, I told you it's your task force, so tell me, you know, how you want to go about it.
You don't have to
Let's
go through
start
any
with
personal
the,
things.
let's start with the subcommittees because those definitely have many different perspectives that went into the findings. Are there any 5s in there?
Well, let's just go item by item.
Okay, all right.
Or the-
road. That's what I think is gonna happen, to be quite honest with you. I think teams will push it further down the road. And we even have a struggle now with people really looking at classification when it's very obvious. So I didn't think that you're gonna potentially have an issue with people discontinuing to push that, you know, the label further down the.
On the other hand, sometimes it's difficult to identify a disability. You know, I understand these ones, but it can be very difficult to identify disability for students 1 through 6. Specifically, if they have a learning disability. And so this would also allow teams to have that flexibility. I think when we look across the country too.
If that's the case, then you also have the process where you can provide them with services through general education, not necessarily identify them.
Right, but if they're already identified in preschool and now they're going to kindergarten, I think that that's where, that this kind of comes
We can still
from.
look at transition planning.
Well, where do we come out of this? Is this something that we want to pursue as a recommendation or not?
Is not complete endorsement.
If you think about 5, do you want to?
Well, I mean,
I just don't, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have been muted for, like, we couldn't hear anything for a while, and then all of a sudden it popped back in, and we're in the middle of a conversation that we don't quite understand what's going on. Is that okay? Is that?
this
Yeah.
is the recommendation about extending the age at which the developmental disability category can be provided. And,
So I almost would think that this could fall, if we think about a bigger topic area, if we are only limiting ourselves to 5, if we talk about eligibility guidelines, that could include universal pre-K, that could include eligibility age, that could include transition services under one bigger umbrella, that perhaps that's something that we need more investigation on to continue to talk about. So if we would think about it as a possible subcategory of just eligibility guidelines in general, that could be something that we could further investigate and discuss.
So I need a clarification because I'm not a strong special ed background. If I had a kindergarten student and they perhaps came out as learning disabled on a assessment, could I continue to say that they were developmentally delayed? Or I would need to put them in that category.
So basically, if I can take a first shot and then people.
I think Brian.
Feel free to jump
I
in,
think
but.
we trust you.
Well, no, but just saying, again, I wasn't part of this subcommittee, but currently planning and placement teams are, if for students who are eligible for special education, ages 3, 4, 5, like you said, all the way through. Once they turn 6, they can no longer have the category of developmental delay and be eligible for special education. So what this is saying is by the age of 8, you can continue to have developmental disability as your primary disability category. But my clarification originally is it can't be a sometimes, but not others, like, because we have to let the federal government know as a state, what is our age? Other states have different ages. In Connecticut, we use 6. So I'm sure the committee talked about the pros and cons of extending that out, but this is pretty specific finding and would require legislative change and would require statewide training because we cite districts. If you turn 6 and you still have that disability category, you're cited by the state because that's a violation of that statute.
but nothing precludes a
And then it
district.
changes based on an evaluation, but nothing precludes a district from identifying earlier than that. a
Exactly.
different category.
Exactly.
So no
extending the
changes
age-
needed.
Extending the age to 8, would allow districts to continue
It would.
to do that. So
Yes. So there really, in the way this is worded, there wouldn't necessarily need to be a change. That's why I was asking for the clarification. It's not necessarily asking to extend it to 8, but just provide more.
And I believe our discussion
Emphasis.
people were getting dropped out and then coming back into the system after that age. So we were worried that there wasn't going to be a continuum of services because they didn't need it.
I see.
So, and that's what our concern was, like, you're now not giving them something they should probably remain and continue with. And then they come back and you're starting all over. And I think that's what our discussion, Susan, right, Susan, because I know she was on part of our task force.
Yes, and in addition, we were talking about students that have needs such as hearing loss and vision. If you don't identify them early, then they're not getting the correct services for what they need. Usually, so we want to make sure that if we do, if a recommendation is made, Brian, to make it to age 8, that people are actually getting the services. They're not getting delayed services that are specific to people that are blind, deaf, and hard of hearing until they're age 8. And that was our only thing. But it seems to me like it's fine at age 6 that the state is actually monitoring it. Is that what I'm getting, Brian? That it doesn't need to change, that you think it's monitored very well right now?
Well, it wasn't my recommendation to extend it, so I was just asking for clarification. I mean, I'm just like letting people know what we currently do. And I haven't been in the discussions for, it makes sense what you're talking about, you know, the early identification, but there's a way to do this without changing extending the developmental delay by putting emphasis on comprehensive evaluations, updating state guidelines around identification for autism and all those different pieces, I think would be very helpful and accomplish.
I think
what it is
that makes sense.
So I think that might be the next, like, there's two down, to say
Yeah.
something about
Yeah.
that.
It seems like though that this is asking for the possibility to have developmental delay category up until the 8th birthday. But I think that this is, so that would require a change.
It would. And then we would just have to, if that's the recommendation, we would just have to
With clarification of eligibility.
rewrite this.
Right.
Yeah,
And I think a piece of that is what I'm seeing for our pre-K, where there isn't a disability, anything. And these kids are coming in with all these great needs and all this stuff, like as Andy had written, this misbehavior is a manifestation of child deficit or need, but it's more of, the developmental delay that they're so far behind that they're acting out and responding to the environment because they're just not at that point that they're expected to be in pre-K. And what I'm seeing from my pre-K teachers are that these kids are really having difficulties and being very violent at times. And you're having to put your hands on them. That kind of goes with restraint seclusion because they are getting, it's not the same classroom we would have saw 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? And they're really, again, stressed out and trying to deal with it because they kind of feel like they don't have a say in it because they're not IEP. You know, they're not they don't have that kind of, and it takes a long time to get them there. And it could be a parent doesn't see that, and they're trying to work as a team to try to build all that too. So I work with like I said, I work with 18 to 22-year-olds. So I just hear this stuff coming from our preschool teachers.
So I'm just trying to figure this out because I'm just trying to see the vision of kind of what gets in there and what like ranks as most important kind of a thing. But I also think that what I'm hearing and what I'm responding to is that there's general ed issues that we're trying to manage through special education, right? We have a ton of kids coming through pre-K, K1, 2 that are exhibiting some significant issues, right? And an IEP is not the answer. I heard Superintendent Torres really loud and clear about some of the cultural responsive implicit bias that's embedded in some of these things. So I worry about those things too, right? So that if we're putting these changes, I worry about those things for that reason that we're looking at. I think when Brian talked about looking at our, identification through autism and making sure we're better, but some of this has more to do than just trying to delay and push an evaluation down, because the other thing is not only we have to make a change at the state level, then you're going to look at districts and districts are going to have to try to tease out, well, what the heck does this mean? Right. And right now it's kind of vulnerable. As I mentioned, we are vulnerable as a special education unit. No one wants to hear about any big changes that anyone has to even wrap their heads around. I think people protecting parents and their rights it's a huge thing. But I think that this is something that I would say, again, fits into the category of really just looking at our guidelines, tightening those up and really looking at general education and how we manage.
Well,
it's not something for special ed to take.
I'm very sympathetic to what Tara said.
Yeah, I know.
That this is a broader issue. And this is a smaller piece. The big issue is entry of kids in the school, whether they're ready. And I do think that the other issue that Tiffany mentioned is critically important, which is if we really had the level of services and support in the general education environment, we'd have a lot less need for special education. But we don't. And so what do we do with that? So I think those are both sort of general issues that we really need to cover. Do we have a consensus on moving the availability of using the DD label until age 8? Do we have a consensus in favor of that sort of idea or not? I was hearing both sides of that.
I don't think there's a consensus. I think our subcommittee still needs to, we would like to get, I think, I don't know, subcommittee speak, more input, but I don't think it's how necessary is that change right now is what I want to know when we have,
And I think if we had a subcommittee and Brian came to that one, we could have the discussion, so we don't take up this group's time.
Let's put it on
Maybe.
hold.
You know what I mean? I'm just saying,
Let's-
because then we could have that, because I think we were at a first one, but then we had subsequent ones and you weren't there. So maybe that could get us more information.
Okay, I'm going to say right now, we do not have consensus on this moving forward. Okay, and we can revisit. All right, the next one,
Can I just ask a clarifying question about process? Are we gonna go through each of the, because we missed a chunk of it, like somebody, like Susan said, so it wasn't clear to us who are virtual, what
we're
is
gonna
our
go
process?
through, we're gonna go through every single one for the subcommittees, then we'll make a decision on the individuals, okay?
So we're gonna talk them through, like.
Yeah. And we're gonna decide whether or not, we have consensus on it first. And then we're gonna have to revisit the ones that we have consensus on to decide what are the 5 big,
Areas.
most important areas. Okay,
But Alicia, the only thing you missed was a discussion on the mental disability. No other discussion.
I'm just, as far as process, I'm wondering if there's value to talking through the different findings, but then having people rate them independently and letting the top findings rise to the top. Does that make sense?
I'm sure we will. I'm sure,
Okay.
but I think we still have to talk through them, just. to
No,
make sure
I
that-
agree. I just was,
People
I
are-
was wondering how we were all gonna give our numbers in this limited amount of time and in this setting. So that's all.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. The prevalence rate of special ed eligibility is comparable to the rates nationwide. There should be a focus on appropriate and timely identification rather than a focus on reducing the prevalence rate.
Well, let's have a general discussion about eligibility. Which is really the issue here. Go on, Brian.
No, okay, well, I just wanted to make, I don't know where the statement came from as far as the focus on reducing prevalence rates. I was just wondering. I don't think it's ever a good thing to just.
It is a message out there sometimes.
Yeah, because we're always striving for appropriate and timely identification, and also just wondering where the comparative rates came to other states. And obviously, we've seen a drastic increase in our prevalence rates since 2008, like significant.
Ours rates.
So it's like understanding that more than, it's not that we work to reduce it, the need is there, but just understanding that and the interplay of tier 1. For me, just summarizing the eligibility, I think it's a critical, important topic. And we've talked about appropriate identification, understanding culture and, implicit bias and the identification process and general education support. Like those 3 areas are coming through in these recommendations, but as you keep increasing prevalent rates, I mean, it gets to a point of,
Let's
the triangle is inverted. We're talking about a quarter of our students, 20%.
Well, let's be clear that Connecticut is, when you look at all 50 states, Connecticut is relatively high. When you look at New England, Connecticut is relatively low in terms of eligibility rates, but that doesn't, what do you do with that? It doesn't have any meaning.
It's just never a good thing to have a message that we're looking to reduce prevalence. We wouldn't be behind that as a state,
I get it.
But the issue underneath it obviously is important.
Well, let me ask this, Brian. We're here to make, eventually recommendations that may mean change in law or policy. Is there, except for, conscientiously applying the rules of eligibility, which presumably is being done now, are there any other changes that you see as necessary in the whole eligibility field?
Changes in the eligibility field, well, I mean, I think just, again, focusing on what we have in front of us today, I think it's important to provide planning and placement teams with updated information around comprehensive evaluations, the interplay between tiered interventions in general education and how that informs planning and placement teams, and then the concept of what it means to exit a student from special education. I don't think there's often a lot of discussion around that or topics, but it's interesting that once students are identified at a young age, they stay identified for the most part. What does it look like to receive the interventions that are necessary, have them support general education, and no longer require specialized instruction before the age of 22 or 18? So I think for me, it's providing support to the teams around process on both what it looks like to identify and what are the exit criteria for students.
So for me, as a former superintendent in an urban area, I really worry about the disproportionate number of kids being identified for special education that are kids of color or poor children. And I feel very, very strongly that we need to look at that, because what I think is happening is there are large class sizes. There are no interventions for these children, either behaviorally or academically, because the resources aren't there to provide those. And the only thing that allows in some districts kids to get extra help is to be identified as special education. And I'm not saying that's awful, although I worry tremendously about the larger, 6,000 more kids being identified for special education since I think 11, 12. And the population dropping at the same time. So am I concerned? Yes. Why am I concerned? I'm concerned because the achievement gap with special ed is also growing. And what are we doing for these children? And I'll just speak from my personal experience, and you've heard me say it before. I watched young children, K-1-2 kids, being identified left and right for special education because of behavior issues, which I believed were more trauma induced and were not able to be handled because I did not have in Bridgeport the interventions necessary. So I disagree with this piece. I probably am at 5 on that. And I would, I hear what Brian's saying about reducing the prevalence rate. I want everybody to have whatever program they need, but I just wonder whether all of the kids that we are identifying really need what we are giving them.
So let me take a moment to disagree. In my practice, I am seeing serious under-identification. I am seeing numerous child fine violations. I'm seeing numerous children who are seriously in need of services or not being identified for services. Now, where I agree with Fran is that if we had those interventions in the general education setting, there'd be a lot less need for special education segregation. But saying that we're not going to, saying that we believe that there's over-identification and that the problem is general education doesn't seem to me to be any answer. Either we deal with it in this context or, it's not going to be dealt with.
So if I can just say something, I'm saying this even when we talk about implicit bias, it is a dangerous situation to give a child, an African-American or Latino male in particular, a label when you're already considered to be less intelligent, regardless of how we feel we're all evolved. But giving a little child that label, when again, it could be based off of environmental factors, which we know at the end of the day should be ruling students out. I think it's a grave danger to do that. Just like we look at other exclusionary practices, we're looking at our metrics like discipline and things of that sort. We have to be so careful because even when we're looking at the category of emotional disabilities, those are little Black boys. So again, if we're going to do this, we have to get it right because just as Brian mentioned, once a child receives special education services, they're carrying that throughout, and it limits access and opportunities for some students. I'm all about giving services to the students who require that. But again, our purpose should not be in special education to fix what happens or doesn't happen in general ed. We have to get better in general education. So even if some of that's our push, then we have to do that. But we can't take on what general education can't fix, nor should we be slapping labels on kids that's going to impact them long-term with access and opportunity. And we see it every day. So I just say we have to be extremely careful about those things.
Catherine,
And no, I mean, I mostly agree with Tiffany, actually. We mostly agree. And with Fran, and obviously we were together in the district at the same time, right? And so with little, I represent a lot of little kids who are exactly the little kids we're talking about. I just want to note though, little kids that have trauma and might have a mental health diagnosis, I mean, that is an appropriate, potentially, eligible child, right? But if we're not pouring in the resource at that youngest age, then, I mean, case by case, what I agree with Tiffany in principle, case by case, we're sitting at a table. What are we doing with that child in that moment? We're trying to get them as much support as we can, and we're going to ask for a one-to-one para because there's not enough paras in that building. That's the only way we can get a para for that building is to get a one-to-one and get it through special ed. It shouldn't be that way. So potentially, if we're looking at, tier 1 and tier 2 interventions in a lot of districts are like kind of a joke. I don't know how else to say that. Like they're the first people to go. We know that, right? SRBI is so inconsistently managed. I mean, I have districts that tell me we literally don't do that here. Okay, so if we want to do a both and, we can look at what more do we need to say about SRBI and tier interventions to make it clear that this is not like, do it if you can and cut it when you have to cut it. But at the same respect, I don't want to reduce prevalence just for the sake of reducing it. And I do want to acknowledge that some of these little kids do have, diagnosis based in, in trauma for their experiences. And, God willing, they work through it, they get what they need, and then they're not special ed forever. And maybe they are, maybe they're not, but we should also, work against that stigma.
all right, Heather, and then Kathy Gabrielson.
So I think a lot of this ties in, this conversation on this bullet ties into the next bullet. I think Brian spoke to it a little bit around kind of the need for more guidance, training around culturally responsive assessment, comprehensive assessment, tiered intervention, what it should actually look like, what should be required of districts in doing it. Because it seems like the conversation we're having is repetitive of the things that are needed and should be required in regular ed are resulting in a shift of eligibility to special ed because those aren't there in certain districts because of funding, because of cuts, because of all of those things. And so guidance is guidance, but if there was guidance and some accountability to what was needed for districts, I think those two tie together closely.
Kathy?
Thank you. I just want to say that I agree with much of what my colleagues Tiffany and Heather have shared regarding the determination of eligibility for specialized instruction. I think that this is such a compound issue. It's not simply about how an evaluation was designed or what was left out of an evaluation. It's not simply about whether or not SRBI or MTSS was provided to a student. It is not simply about whether or not conversation has been held at a deep dive regarding environmental, situational, and linguistic issues that surround that child that's sitting in front of you on at that table and is the focus of the decision-making process. I think that the complexity of determining eligibility can be guided, not simply, but at least structurally by having criteria that the State Department puts out for us to look at that's updated regularly according to the DSM, according to educational constructs, for all of the 15 areas that we are responsible for discussing and considering when we are talking about eligibility. Right now, there are some that exist, and it is considered to be a best practice to utilize them in the state. Years and years ago, I can remember Roger Frant training us and telling us, you are required to use these. Now it is a best practice to use these. When PPT members and participants have a structure in place that they can follow to determine whether or not a child is eligible, the deeper discussion is much more robust. Attorneys have generated some of these for districts for their clients. The State Department has some, but they do not have them all. And I think that when we are looking at putting a structure into place, there needs to also be training behind what exists within the structure. And I've been doing this for a long time. I've been to many trainings on the specific criteria characteristics, what it means to have an emotional disability compared to peers, looking at the duration and intensity that we have seen things demonstrated with a child, and what exactly is the adverse impact on the education of the child that we're discussing in relation to that criteria or characteristic. But what isn't trained, what isn't provided in any of that training really at a focal point is what constitutes an environmental concern. What constitutes a sociocultural concern? Many of our PPT participants think that simply means have they lived in the same place all of their lives and spoken the same language all of their lives. They don't necessarily understand what is the dialectical difference in a language that may be used at home versus what's taught in school. They don't understand necessarily what having different cultures represented in the home and what the practices related to those cultures means when you're in school, and how that child has to become duly cultured in order to not be seen as a person with a disability.
Thank you, Kathy.
Training needs to increase for all of that.
I have a question. For in the eligibility, as we talk about all of this, would there be consensus around saying there needs to be a strong SRBI, RTI, MTSS system in every school district? Or maybe a finding is that there is not a strong system. And, you know, even if you have a strong system, if you don't have the people that are going to intervene at tier 2 and tier 3, that's a waste also. So is there a consensus around needing that prior to identification of special ed?
Well, I think you would say that, but you also at the same time would say, and also SRBI cannot be used as an impediment.
Right, it can't preclude.
Right, which is
Yeah.
already statutorily, but I think you need to say those two things together.
Yeah.
When you say
Could we agree on that as I mean, it just, I can't let this task force go. I know it's not mine, but it would be very difficult for me to let it go forward without addressing some of that. I still have memories of my first day on the job and drawing the RTI as superintendent in Bridgeport and asking who does tier 1, who does tier 2, and hearing the classroom teacher, the classroom teacher, the classroom teacher, because there were no other people available. And so I do think that that is something that needs to be addressed. And quite frankly, I think there needs to be more statewide training on that. And more of a push to mandate it, but I'm going to recommendations there.
Well,
So-
that's another task force,
Yeah.
Brian. In a policy brief, that's what page 1 and 2 talk about, what you're talking about. Basically, insufficient training is really important in high poverty districts where increased special ed students have been the highest and teacher turnover is the highest. So it correlates with that, what you're saying.
It does, it correlates. And I'm going to suggest, I think we have a finding there, you know.
Can I just ask, will the finding include the need for the lack of staffing currently? Okay.
Absolutely.
Runs through the
I think
entire
that will become the number 1 piece. And I'm gonna ask if we take a 10-minute break and come back to the table. I know it seems like we're spending a lot of time, but I think the important pieces are coming out on the table. So thank you. Take a 10-minute break. I did make a quiche. There is fruit. I made banana bread and please help yourselves.
Sorry, you're live.
Okay, we're ready to begin again. I think,
Talks about money.
if I'm not mistaken, I think we have taken care of the eligibility findings.
Right, and
Yes.
I want to make sure that we're going to talk about, sort of the structure, and there have been quite a few people that have mentioned it, that there should be, or that we need to look at perhaps updating the criteria, for, special ed, specifically with the autism guidelines now being updated in 2005, to make sure it's culturally, responsive, and, that it's comprehensive evaluation system, that the systems in place for evaluation and identification perhaps should be reviewed, and that should be something, that schedule of updating that criteria is something that we should be looking at. So that it's been sort of mentioned, but not focused on, and I think that's worth the conversation.
Brian, where are we on both the autism guidelines and the LD guidelines? Both of which I understood were under review.
There's no active work on the autism guidelines. There have been some adjustments and updates made outside of the main document, but for SLD dyslexia, we're working on the executive summary as well as the guidelines, and those should be out relatively soon. But as was mentioned earlier, we don't have every single disability category, but we have guidance around the main eligibility factors for special education. And so for example, we haven't had guidelines on other health impairments to help teams.
That might be something you should look at as a finding investment.
Although, and we can talk about this too, and I have no problems updating that or, finding out, coming to consensus on updating those specific tools, but they are tools to help planning and placement teams to answer those 3 basic questions. And there are requirements. I know Kathy mentioned earlier that there are suggestions as best practice tools, but the documents are created based on the legislative requirements. So for example, for our multi-evaluation report for SLD dyslexia, all of the legislative requirements are built into the form. So if you're not using the form itself, then you could be missing aspects of what's needed comprehensively. That's different than autism, for example. So there's the different categories would need a different approach. But I said earlier that I think that's a great recommendation, to take a look at, provide the teams with the updated information that's needed to help get to the point of eligibility to make sure that it's appropriate and accurate.
Okay. Are there particular areas where we're looking at? Do you disagree that the autism guidelines need updating?
No, I don't disagree with that. I think that, again, the guidelines were in draft form for a number of years, and there were reasons for that prior to us coming together as a task force. But I think there's particular caution of identification of autism outside of an educational diagnosis versus an educational diagnosis for any student that requires specialized instruction. So don't disagree with the need to have updated information.
Okay. And how about in the 2 areas? I mean, let me ask 2 more areas. ED obviously is one that's become very big recently.
Yep.
Do you see a need for updating those guidelines?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mentioned autism because it was on the list, but I think that is a finding that is something that needs to be looked at in terms of a comprehensive look at how we are identifying students, and to make sure that it's culturally responsive, that we're not, that we are meeting the needs of our EL students, Black and brown students, everybody, that look at those structures hasn't been done comprehensively. And maybe it has been done, but it needs to be done again.
Okay. And one other area, I've got to say, I've had enormous amount of parent confusion on OHI as to when ADD is a 504 issue, when it's an IDEA issue. And that's an area where there have never been guidelines. Is that something that you guys are looking at all about?
Well, there are guidelines. We don't have a form, an eligibility form, although one's been developed. I'm pretty sure it was one of the board attorneys that developed the OHI and then used kind of systematically across all of the districts. But
then parents don't have access to it.
what's that?
But then parents don't have access to that.
To the form?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I mean, there definitely is a need. I would answer that question with specialized instruction. You know, I mean, we have guidance on that, what the criteria are. Do you have a disability? Is it impacting general education? And does it require specially designed instruction? So that we have to make sure as we're updating individual disability guidance documents that it's not limiting or expanding, eligibility, because it comes down to answering those 3 questions and teams working through a process to get to that point. But that's definitely something the state would be able and willing to support.
Okay, so if we have a finding for eligibility, I would say that we are looking at, and Andy will put this tremendously well, I know, but that special ed eligibility needs to be better defined with updated guidelines, that MTSS, RTI, or SRBI needs to be fully functioning in every single district, because it's not. You understand, I'm saying this is what needs to be. We will find that right now it is not where we need to be. I think that's it, I think that captures it. There'll be some subcategories under that Andy will bring forward.
Well,
okay, let's move to funding. Is there anything in the funding category that you totally disagree with?
Well, I'll tell you my basic argument, which I make all the time, is that excess cost reimbursement does not fund special education. And we've got, I would like to see a system where we're actually funding the special education provided to the vast majority of kids in district. Excess cost reimbursement, is an insurance policy for the catastrophic cases. Yes, if we're going to have the insurance policy, it should be fully funded. But I am much more interested in focusing on actually getting money into the day-to-day special education programs throughout the state.
So the ECS dollars that are supposed to go to special ed, is that reality, or would you prefer to have a separate category for special ed funding from the state?
I think it's a very hard issue.
I think it is.
And maybe we don't have to get that far.
We need more information because we don't.
More information needed. Okay. All right. But if you look at what they have, what Patrice and her committee have done, Patrice, maybe you can speak to it a bit.
Well, I mean, the issue of adequate support for most of our special ed students is really addressed in the second bullet. And there were truly, some of us remember back in the day when there was a special ed sliding scale reimbursement grant for overall special ed costs. That was then supposedly rolled into the ECS formula. It's really not there. And it's like the excess cost. Overall, the costs have increased significantly and the resources have not. I would like to include, or see if there's consensus around addressing the issue that Tiffany and Leslie raised about the impact on large districts of funding special ed services and charters and magnet schools. Because I think
Okay.
that's something that we didn't explicitly identify in our findings.
Is there any support for if we had a excess cost fully funded? Any support for reimbursing? It's 4.5 times now, the per pupil expenditure. I've always wanted more district special ed programs and wondered about reimbursing at the district level for programs at 3% or 3 times, and perhaps at the risks for 3.5 or 4 times. Any support for that?
Well, the pot of money remains the same, then changing from 4.5 to 3, just may slightly change the distribution of it. Now, under the current policy, an in-district program can be eligible for excess cost reimbursement, but it's an enormous pay to document that.
I just trying to have districts create their own programs.
Encourage that.
Encourage.
But there's gotta be the
creation.
money in the pot for it to be a true incentive.
And do we do that through just adding the special ed weight to the ECS formula where the money is still fungible when it comes in? Or do we talk about a grant program to sort of create centers of excellence in districts?
So I worry that putting it into the ECS funding is not gonna guarantee that it goes to the program that it's intended to go to.
Right?
I'm very worried about that.
Right.
That the money goes where it's intended, because it's not currently. In all places.
So respond to what I just said, which is a grant program for centers of excellence in districts. Does that make any sense?
I have to have more information on what that would look like.
And that would be down the road in a recommendation.
I mean, I think we need more information on what that could possibly be. And when you think about different districts, I think some of the smaller districts are gonna struggle with that as well.
Some of the poorer
And
districts.
some of the poorer districts. So when you have very small districts, and we do have quite a few of those in the state, and we have our poorer districts, those are the two places where it's gonna be difficult to manage. So I would be wary. I'd have to think a little bit more on what that would look like, just to make sure it's equitable across the state.
Tiff?
I just have a question. Is there a way for us to do something? This seems like this is totally off for like special education teachers. Meaning, I only started to think about that when you were just talking about what was going on in districts. I'm just thinking about looking at, how people have been trying to get bonuses for sign-ons and things of that sort. Is there something that we can do by way of certification that's not going to disrupt unions and things of that sort, enough to be able to get special education staffing? Meaning, if there's something you get a credit towards retirement, something. Because I'm just still, again, worried back to that first issue about kind of where we are and where we're going. We don't have people. Is there something that we can do, if we're talking about grants, is there something that we can do that's going to help us with the recruitment and retention effort as it relates to special education staffing?
I've tried to get data on length of service of special ed teachers versus regular ed teachers, because my hunch is that special ed teachers serve a lot shorter periods of time than regular ed teachers. But, I have nothing to support
I'm just
that.
wondering if there's something that we can do just about our workforce.
And so retention of special ed teachers seems to me to be a very important issue.
Can you get a credit? Yeah, when we look, I think.
It'll be ineligible for administrators.
Under services, I think.
Services, talk about a little bit about
They
that.
could, yeah.
And then we can go back to the
Yeah.
funding if necessary.
I was just thinking about.
All right, is there anything here in the funding that you totally disagree with? And my guess would be, we will need more information on having a separate line for special ed, but we certainly will be asking for a full funding of excess costs, correct? Okay.
Could you please, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to make sure you were done with excess costs.
Well,
Oh.
the only other piece in that is, a model contract for private providers.
That's what I was waiting for you to
Okay,
finish.
go ahead, Karen.
And the final one too, the consistency of charges.
Yes,
Yeah, I mean, we talked about a model contract a few years ago, CAPSEP and Concase worked with SDE on this issue a little bit. I think a potential problem is that it takes away the ability of each district and each private provider to identify what their unique situation is going to be. In general, from CAPSEP, maybe from Concase, in general, I think over the last several years, I think it was maybe 2018 or 2019 that we got the report from the auditors. This process has been much smoother in terms of getting contracts done in a timely way and smoothing them out. I think the first couple of years, first year especially, was very difficult because attorneys on both sides were trying to sort it all out. But once you came to agreement on that one, then the next year it's a little bit easier. The next year it's a little bit easier. And if you have a student that's a little bit different, then you work that out, but you're already working it out from a place of agreement because you've had the agreement the previous year. So I don't know from the perspective of CAPSEP broadly that this is a strong issue. Districts may feel differently.
I don't believe that it's a strong issue for districts. I never would have a concern with a model. I think that districts would definitely not want to be forced into having any kind of contract. A model or here's something you can use. I wouldn't disagree with it. I don't know that it's necessary. Certainly from, our issue recently of getting the contract with the private providers. And as Karen said, the first year it was very like, wait, who's writing it? Who's in charge? No, I'm writing it. No, you are. So, but after that, I think we're in a much better place.
Well, so one of the recommendations from the CEA report was that we have a state approved levels tuition to private providers as they do in many states. Certainly Massachusetts has one.
I would say that's separate than this, though.
Yeah.
Right.
But how do you feel about that?
I think you risk losing placement for kids. In my personal experiences, kids who are, have extreme challenges with learning, extreme challenges with behavior, self-injury, aggression, and if the tuition was capped and the districts had fewer choices, I'm not sure what would happen to those kiddos, and they might be placed out of state.
Do we have a district to district comparison of how people, what they're paying out? So that we have an idea of where the ranges are?
Well, there is data available on amount spent on out of district tuition.
And as a RESC, I know I listen to our board of directors, which is, what we do for their board of ed. And we try to keep it really low because we want to make sure we keep kids in the state, not going out of state. So that's a big thing for us. But that's a decision within the district.
Right.
Versus across, but I also listened at the state conference. I was with, I'm trying to remember what was the school that we heard her speak. She talked about exactly everything we do as a RESC. However, they have 1-to-1 and the amounts that they were paying,
Sometimes 2-to-1.
2-to-1 was exorbitant. But it's a private school within Connecticut where RESC was better, we were offering the same services. And it was based on restraint and seclusion and how our numbers we were using the same GMT, blah, 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 blah. So, that's a piece that I would be interested in getting more information, obviously, on if it became a part of this conversation.
Well, do you do a la carte at RESC?
We do, well, it's more of depending on the needs. If a kid comes who's more of a 2-on-1, then it would go up. Transportation is always that cost is just crazy across the state, I think. But we have if our kids in our young kids PLC, they would have a different tuition rate. And then it would go, the older kid has a little bit more, and then the kid in our therapeutic day program might be a little different, but our magnet schools is also very less expensive, to go that, if people are gonna go there's a piece of that too.
But each kid comes with their own IEP, with their own level of services.
Not at that school, except if they had an IEP going with them. Yes, our kids are all, we all have kids with IEPs.
And the IEP,
That's
and you know,
what-
based on IEP services, there
And
could be different costs involved, right?
There are a number of approved privates that are a la carte. So, you know, if you need so many hours of speech a week, it's gonna be this cost. If you don't need speech, then it's this cost. Staffing ratios, you know, do you need one-to-one staffing? Do you need two-to-one staffing? That's an additional cost. But I know that that is true for a number of approved privates.
And I think also from a rest perspective, you know, it varies greatly from individualized a la carte services to bundled services, depending on the rest, depending on the program and the needs of the kids in the program. And I think it also, from like even a staffing perspective, what you're talking about, there's places in the state that run much smaller programs that are contracting speech and language pathologists in the same way that even at the rest that a district would be, so the cost is then getting passed to the district. So what somebody may view as an exorbitant cost, they're sometimes dealing with the same shortages that we're dealing across districts to say, we have to provide speech and language services for this. We cannot, we don't have a full-time speech and language pathologist. We don't have the need or can't cover the cost. So we're having a contract for that in the same way. And I guess we're not a private provider, obviously, but one hesitation I would have about really prescribing that is you need to make sure you can have access to the level of expertise you need in order to manage the students that are being outplaced. And I think one thing we've seen, particularly over the last 10 years, is the complexity of kids and the needed level of expertise and to effectively manage those and program for those kids is significant. And we want to make sure those kids are getting high quality services. So I think it's the important conversation to have, but it's.
Well, I mean, there's an area that we want to delve into. I mean, it looks like all these proposals are to create some level of uniformity about private providers.
I think it would be very difficult to create a high level of uniformity. You know, all approved privates go through the approval process. Excuse me, so that allows for some uniformity in terms of what kinds of standards schools are required to meet, but you know, the list of approved private providers varies from, you know, very small schools to much larger schools to hospitals and hospital settings. So I'm not sure what level of uniformity you're looking for and to what end that would serve kids.
So a couple of questions. Number one, I guess my question is, in the rests, in the 6 rests, are you seeing similar costs for similar disabilities or placements? That's one. And the second one is, I hear from superintendents all the time how incredibly expensive private placements are. I have to put that on the table. Is there uniformity in the costs that come from similar placements, let's say? I understand that each child is different in placement, but given if I need a 2-to-1 and severe autism, would it be the same in different places?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know. I'm not knowledgeable about other schools.
That's,
and when I'm in PBTs where that's the issue, I never hear, oh, we've got these 3 options and let's pick the least expensive one. It's always, we're desperate to find one option.
That is the issue. And so if we're trying to do, and there's a big, within the rest, within the private providers, there is differences in cost, but when you look at you know, what the individual service that's being provided or what the training is, you know, I at least can understand, you know, so if I'm placing a kid at Heron's school and I get the invoice and it's, you know, if there's a question, I would be taking that up with that school directly. It would be very hard to say that school should charge the same as a different school with a different need. And to Andy's point, I don't think that the conversation is coming up about, I need to pick the cheapest school. It's where can I find a place that is going to appropriately program for my child?
Well, to be
And
fair,
that
I
is
mean,
the issue.
historically, they have had, you can tell where they have the closer relationships, right? And so I wouldn't normally say no to them just because there's a relationship, but historically I go to PPCs where it's clear that they want a kid in a certain place that they're used to having kids go to.
Well, I think that there's a familiarity with
Yeah.
programs, right? So as a special ed director, I'm not familiar with every program
Yeah.
in districts, but I know if a certain program did well with my
Yeah.
students. So
Yeah.
I may be more likely to say that that is one of the three. It's not because of the cost though.
I heard sometimes it's the cost, but I agree that I don't think that's the driving force in most things. But I do think there are some districts that are like, we always go to these three places.
So I think the consensus is that this is not an issue
That now,
that we want to devote a lot of resources to.
is not.
This is not an issue that we want to spend a lot of time on. Is that sort of the consensus?
Fine with me.
And,
But
let
the
me,
next time the superintendent says, we know that we're paying X for this child, and the superintendent next door is paying Y for that child that has, they claim the same needs, you and I will have to deal with that.
We'll have to deal with it
No,
because I hear it all the
we're talking
time.
about not the same school.
That
Yes.
would be a
conversation with the school.
I would say call it that private school, but then also to me, it's not a matter of asking the schools to change their, their structure. It's where is their funding come, like the excess cost we were just talking about.
Yeah.
You know, the other side of it.
Okay,
well, has the audit, let me just ask Karen, the recommendations of the auditors, have they basically been fully implemented and?
Well, I can't speak for everybody, but I will say that, you know, certainly the contracts, that turned around, you know, it was, painful at first, I think, not because people didn't want to do it, but just getting to an agreement.
Yep.
But I think that's turned around, in a very, very positive way.
I was just gonna say, there's several recommendations since 2014, 15,
Right.
all the way through current. So
Yeah.
every single recommendation that they have has not, but for a reason, every recommendation has been responded to, and the legislatively required ones are being responded to, like you said, and audited on a yearly basis. So they're looking, when the auditors go in, they're looking for those contracts and finding the contracts, and when they don't, they're citing that, and then there's reasons why, you know, to follow up. So from the contract perspective, but there's been several recommendations from those reports initially that have either been for good reason not fulfilled or turned into different recommendations over the years.
And I would like Orlando, who wrote the policy brief, to talk about that quickly, because of the fact that, you know, you mentioned CEA.
Yeah.
You know,
The issue of cost was first brought up by the auditors. And they're the ones who are saying we need a fixed price list to give you starting place. You have no idea, you get calls from different providers, and you have no idea. You
It's
know.
really hard to hear you. I'm sorry. If you could, thank you.
Okay, the recommendation for a price list comes from the state auditors. And their argument is that there is no base to starting point for districts to determine whether they're being overcharged or not. Now, let's face it, if you pay too much for one thing, you're gonna be able to pay less for something else. So it really is an issue. And I've had superintendents, not superintendent, or today tell me, we don't know if this is right. They give us these two contracts. We have no idea if we're paying too much or too little. So that's why that's in there. Massachusetts has it. You don't have to take their rates. You can be structured any way you want. But just to allow providers to charge anything they want, and you go for it because there's nothing else to do. Look at the cost you cost someone to improve. And there's nothing in place right now to give you any reference as to whether you want to use that or not. So what you could do is, at a minimum, would be, all right, we're gonna put out there a suggested cost. What is reasonable? And I'm hearing here that risks are more cost effective than private sector providers. Why is that? Well, private sector providers, even though they may be nonprofits, they make.
So I missed that last. sentence.
Nonprofits, even though they consider nonprofits, they do make, they just don't have stockholders. Okay,
A clarifying question, are you saying that everyone should charge the same, or that everyone should have a publicized, for lack of a better term, price list?
I should
Yeah,
say the
lack of a
state
better
should have a price that guides you and says, this is what a reasonable cost is. Okay, so you can then look at that and go to the provider and say, wow, you're like double what the state says where you should be. And that's all we're saying, because right now there's nothing.
How do you think the state would put that together?
I'm not gonna talk to the state, but how others do it, Massachusetts does it. I don't see why it's a problem.
I think the other significant variance that impacts this, when you look across the small state of Connecticut, bargaining contracts, which vary greatly when we talk about the rest from northeastern Connecticut down to Fairfield County, and the cost of staff impacts the cost of providing programs. And so to say that across the state, the cost is going to be the same in Putnam, Connecticut as it's going to be in Greenwich is not realistic, unless teacher contracts look very different.
Yeah, that's true. You would have to have costs be regional, of course, and you go down to Greenwich and it's much more expensive than if you go up to Putnam. But at least you have a starting point. Right now, there's nothing. All you know is what they charge you, and you have no idea what the business next year is.
So maybe it comes down to, transparency, like you were suggesting, because every APSEP submits their budgets. So we see that's part of the approval process is they have budget, they have a line for staffing, what the staffing requires, and then those different pieces. We've been asked before to generate allowable costs for planning and placement teams. We've been very hesitant to do that because we don't want to take away any flexibility or considerations at the local level, based on what the student needs. But I would say there are some processes in place now because of the auditors and the work that they've done and the work that the approved privates have done to, here's our budget, here's what we're working from, and then when a district puts in a referral, they should be getting information about what the cost is so that there's that understanding up front. But
Wait, sorry, they don't get that now?
to your point,
When I make a referral for a student, I don't ask how much it is. I'm asking if it's an appropriate placement for my child. Once we decide if it's appropriate and we're going to PPT and we're doing a contract, that's when I know around how much, the schools are, but I'm not calling and saying how much do you cost before I decide if I refer a kid there. I mean, that is not a choice. So I do appreciate transparency and I don't know. There is that piece of, we cannot be bringing these costs into any kind of PPT decision.
What
Which I
would be
do
wrong,
get.
what would be wrong with the suggested cost?
And I don't think anything is wrong with the suggested
Well,
cost or price.
state-
I will tell you that the Massachusetts system is like a public utilities commission. That each school submits their proposed rate levels, and the auditors at the State Department of Education review it and then determine the established rate. It's an enormous process. And I'm not sure, I don't think there's any reason to go to that level. What I'm thinking of, and this, I don't know how this would work either. I think you're Amy, right?
No, she's.
Nicole, sorry.
Yes.
You would be really angry if you learned that you placed a kid at High Roads and are paying 80,000, and that your neighboring district is placing a kid at High Road and is being charged 50,000.
Yeah, but
why
is that?
Then, well, I don't know if that's true, but you would be real, that would upset you.
I mean,
I wonder whether there's some system whereby, at least on a general exemplary basis, state could collect information about the cost of private placements, and sort of publicize it, that we have kids placed at this school from this district, and here's what they're being charged.
so there's that difference in cost between those districts. I mean, in between the districts at the same school, that should be able to be seen in the contract. The contract will.
Why would it be seen?
But they wouldn't know that their neighbor,
Compare.
unless they talk to their neighbor.
But you would be able to see why. Maybe the neighboring child has more speech and language services.
But Nicole would have no idea what Prospect is paying.
No,
for that.
no, right, but there may be reasons why they're charging.
For sure.
Yeah.
I would like to speak as a parent for a moment here. As a parent, you get no information on any of that.
Right.
So how am I to know walking into a PPT if the district is guiding towards the ones they typically use or the ones they've had contracts with before? How do I know that we're picking the best school for my student? I'm walking into here having to place my student outside of the district, which is a scary thing for a parent to do at the outset, with very little information or transparency on what, if that's even part of the conversation behind the doors that I'm not privy to. So as a parent, this is a very scary conversation for me to even consider without the transparency being there, without knowing that at the outset, because I don't get that information as a parent.
The information of how many.
Or just of cost, like, well, you know, that maybe I am being guided. These are the 3 schools maybe nearby, or the ones that my district's used to using. But maybe there is somewhere that would be a better placement, but we don't go there because that's more costly.
Can I ask a question? And or, you know, just to your point, I mean, just what Nicole says, I don't think directors spend time even considering cost, right? I mean, sometimes once the contract's there, especially with the rest, I sometimes push back on some things, but that's never the consideration. And the reason why I think that maybe we might want to move on from this conversation is because the situation that we're in now, there's no placements anywhere. So you can't even like.
There's no bargaining power.
It's just that right now, the trend is going to be here. There's no bargaining. There's no, we're at the mercy of who has a spot open. So I only say that just because even if we were to do something today, there's not really much we could do with it because there's not many things open. So I'm just offering that as just, maybe that's something that we consider, you know, at a different time, different date. But right now, if we're trending in the same direction, we don't really have many options.
I agree with you.
Okay,
And
everybody all right with that?
Yeah, and I was just
Okay.
gonna say, friend, when we get to the staffing shortage, I think this, the impact of the staffing shortage is part of what's creating wait lists, and there's wait lists everywhere.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, let's go to services. If we can get through the 3 subcommittees today, I'd be very happy. So services, to be honest with you, some of this we have covered already under eligibility, the tier 1 instruction, and MTSS being in place, and tier 1 instruction. Honestly, my first day with you, you told me that the eligibility for kids for special ed, you felt, I don't know who told me this, but you said that it was in direct correlation to the quality of tier 1 instruction. That's what you said.
Let's move on to parents.
Well, okay, but
I mean,
I'm just saying that.
I mean, I think the general proposition of the quality of general education is a big driver of the need for and the quality of special education is something we all agree on.
And we need to put that in the report. And I absolutely believe that we need to put in there the teaching of reading, and people well versed and well skilled in the teaching of reading, especially in the early grades, is incredibly important. Paraprofessionals.
What do we want to do about that?
I think we need to speak to staffing shortage in general, and maybe we include bullets under it, but I think there's staffing shortages across special education, ranging from teachers, paraprofessionals, administrators, speech pathologists, school psychologists, social workers, like, it's the range. It's not like we see a plethora of staffing in one category across special education, and so I think one of our findings has to be that, and honestly, staffing's at the root of everything we've talked about today, whether it's in general ed or special ed.
I think one of the things that we talked about, and I was on the service committee, and services committee, and I think one of the things that I struggled with and shared it with my colleagues was that, you know, trying to make, not recommendations, but findings, trying to make really robust findings. Right now, it feels like there's this conflict because we just don't have resources in terms of personnel to do the things that we want to do. And so I agree with Heather that, you know, that has to be almost first and foremost.
Yep.
We gotta fix that so that other things can follow.
Well, so we're not making proposals here, but let's talk about the general themes of the type of things. What are the problems with staffing? What do we have? What do we have to do to deal with that?
We did talk about training for our paraprofessionals and maybe pathways into special education. I'm on that subcommittee, and we talked about perhaps having something where the paras had access to some very good research-based things that they have to do for either from the state and housed in one space, so they could earn credentials or the micro credentials in that one space, that it would be transferable between districts. That, you know, you did your, I don't know, bloodborne pathogens here, you don't have to do it there again if you move districts. But we did talk about a lot of the education of paraprofessionals, pathways into teaching as a possibility to help with the staffing shortages across the state. Those may be some unused resources that we have.
I think another along those lines is looking at the idea of creating career pathways for people who want to stay as paraeducators. You know, so how, not everybody, there are some that want to move into certified positions, but for those that want to stay as a paraeducator, what's their career pathway? And how can we support them and improve their skills so that they feel confident and respected in their profession?
Okay, so a finding is that there are not career pathways available for paraprofessionals.
The teacher residency program for special ed is in place right now.
Yeah.
You have to have a degree, and that is stopping a lot of the people that I work with to be able to go that path because they didn't get any college degree.
So limited. Catherine?
Question, I'm sorry, I know we have 3 minutes. From my understanding, what is a lot of the paras that my clients are working with are from a temp agency. And it's clear to me that they don't have the same protections. They don't have the same support. I'm guessing they're not part of the para union for the district. Maybe they have their own temp agency kind of union, whatever it is. But these are the paras that literally the parent is trying to pull into a PPT in the hallway and they're saying, I can't go. I will be retaliated against. I can't tell them what happened in that, in that incident. I can't call you if something happens, I'll get in trouble. So we already have that problem with school-based paras, but I feel like, there's a little bit more traction there. But as we more and more, heavily rely upon these temp agency paras, I think they are even more, disenfranchised, disempowered, and retaliated against. So I know that's like a little bit of a tangent, but I just want to put that out there because I think that especially the large urban districts have to rely upon them even more so. But I'd like to know more. I mean, I don't think I know enough about how that works.
So I mean, in response to what Heather was saying, which is that we're seeing shortages across the board. Let's talk first about what we ought to be doing in general to deal with those shortages. And then what we need to do in each specific area. Just been talking about paras somewhat, but there are all these other areas that teachers and related service providers and administrators that maybe there are specific things we're going to be thinking about in those areas.
I think to Tiffany's earlier.
Can I jump in here? I think one thing that I can't find the raise hand feature either. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I think what Tara was saying for this particular group, when you're talking about the shortage areas, was kind of flipping and thinking about the onboarding and the training that we're providing, and how do we make that easier for districts when we see more movement between districts? And I think that's what she was referring to when she was talking about how can we have certain professional learning experiences that are assured and consistent across the state of Connecticut, that we can say, we know that paras have done this type of training, and there's some reciprocity that when somebody moves, they're not starting from ground zero, because it goes back to the whole resources thing. And, we're taking people out of the classroom to do trainings that they must do in this new district to assure that they are in compliance, and the story goes on and on. But I think if we could think about a system that is more transferable between districts and create some common assured educational experiences for, I'm thinking, paraeducators, that would be a starting point.
So we're back now, and remember, we're doing findings at this point. So career pathways, assured experiences are lacking across districts. I'm still not 100% sure why we have such a shortage of special ed, or mental health workers overall. I'm not 100% sure. I was woken up in this committee, in terms of the respect for special ed teachers, might not be there. And that was, an awakening for me because I always felt they were so highly trained. I'm hearing the paperwork, and I don't want to put that out as a finding. I mean, I put it out as a finding if there's a way to remedy it. Is the paperwork that special ed teachers are required to do, is that a state, or is it a federal piece?
Better, it's case management, it's federally required, the documentation and the writing and the recommendations, and having to make sure it's all finalized and running it through people.
So is there anything that could be reduced? Let me ask that.
Well, I've never heard the level of complaints about paperwork that I've heard since CT Sense.
Yes.
But that could be the transition to CT Sense, not the program itself.
I think it's because it's new. So anytime that you have a new program and a new change, so we have a new document and a new system to use. The state has put a lot of things in place to, support and provide training. I think from a district perspective, the hard piece is getting it to everyone, right? So we already have a shortage of staff, we already have all of those pieces, and now we have to, make sure that we're providing the support. I think that it's definitely getting better. Now, of course, I'm not shy about complaining to Brian because there are still hiccups, but I mean, it is going to get better every single day. And the new IEP, although not perfect, is better for parents. It is better for staff. So yes, the system is, trust me, I curse it right.
Well, but
If we're speaking realistically, it actually will, over time, as we get used to it and as we get better with it, it will actually save us steps. It will actually make the process easier. It's not easier when it's new.
So does
In my
everybody
opinion.
agree with that? Will it make it? Do you have a perspective that it will become easier? Because, I've heard paperwork is overwhelming, and that's why I don't want to be a special ed
It's
teacher.
especially difficult, like I'm in an ag school.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with sending districts, our district, it's especially difficult if the sending district isn't filling out the paperwork in a timely fashion. The special ed teacher thinks it's done, it's not. There's too many people that have to manage the system right now, which I know is something that Brian's been getting feedback on consistently, but I think the paperwork has increased from CT says in terms of managing it and understanding the system. I don't know that it's getting less, but
I don't think this is about CT sets per se. Don't get me wrong, because I was one of the people,
Right.
oh, you're kidding me in the beginning. So it's not about, it's not about CT sets. Like we've moved on beyond the whole piece, to be honest with you. There's some pros and cons. I think just in general, the paperwork and the compliance that special educators have to do, comparatively speaking, and the legality of some of that is always hard. Like in our district, in the majority of our schools, when we can keep people, we have PPT facilitators for that reason. We don't want the special education teachers to have that huge administrative lift. So we're utilizing people to take that administrative burden off of them. So I don't think it's a CT sets conversation. I think it's always existed, right? I think as special educators, this kind of, notion of the paperwork, that's why when we had IEP Direct, or we use Goldbook now in, conjunction with IEPs, we try to take that paperwork burden off of folks. And I think caseloads, right, would be nice too, but then that goes back to, we have to have more teachers in order to reduce caseloads. So I think that this still goes back full circle, that our services have to be centered around the people who are delivering the services, and really, how do we get to that point to really help make sure that the people who are lifting this work are most honored in whatever it is that we do, enough to be able to get to that point. Because I'm telling you, we could talk about all these individual findings, but if you don't have people to implement any of this, it's all for naught.
Well, let me ask about that, Tiffany.
Sure.
Does it make sense to be thinking in terms of having a staff category, which is who are basically doing the paperwork to relieve special ed teachers from doing the paperwork. That work? Does that make any sense?
For our district, that's what we did because our caseload sizes are this, we had to have a trade-off. I can't have, teachers, running the meetings, sending out notices, doing all these things. I think in a smaller district, I don't know if that would be the best way to use their money, right? I just don't know, but I just know for us, your caseload size is this big. The trade-off is we have somebody who's going to take the administrative, and I do think it works for us in that regard, because it takes a lot of that paperwork piece off of individual people. But I don't know if that would work across all districts. That works.
It might be helpful for our task force to define what paperwork is. Because
Yeah.
I think that's a huge.
That's true.
Special ed teachers are progress monitoring their student progress. So that's a lot of work. And they're providing direct services. What can we, you asked about state and federal, it's both. We have some requirements on our teachers and federal also does, but a lot of it's around what Tiffany was saying around the PPT process.
Yeah.
Consent for, testing, referral, eligibility, the IEP itself, progress reports on a quarterly basis, sometimes more than that. So those are all like things that could be laid out and looked at, and then say, is there something here that can be adjusted? Or from a service provider, like from a service model, are there different things, like different practices that districts can try to tap into?
And as an individual teacher,
Yeah.
if my caseload's larger, there's more work, where if I have a small caseload,
Exactly.
I have more time to really look and maybe start thinking about that. It's more individual care, so I can get to know my kids and work with them and get to know them really well at a RESC. Well, that's a RESC, so I'm very lucky at where I work, and I do get to do that, and that's why we work well, because we have all those things, caseloads down, we have paras that are trained. We're constantly talking to each other and communicating it so that our PPTs are structured. We have interest, buy-in, everybody's part of that thing. And I think it's a good model.
Yeah.
But not everybody gets that because we're thinking district to district, and that's where it falls apart in Connecticut.
The report you provided too was helpful because it actually defined case management.
Right.
We didn't,
We did,
we
yeah.
don't really define it. I mean,
Right.
it's not defined in any special education law.
Right.
And case management can be a clerical task, parts of it, right? And you have parent communication, and so all these things we're asking special ed teachers to do. But the districts have the autonomy to say, okay, here's things you're going to be responsible for.
Would it- Would it be fair to say case management and caseloads are impacting the special education workforce in general?
Yeah.
That
That's
it
one
could be-
factor, maybe.
It could be an impact on us
And
having
also-
trouble staffing.
Well, like Brian's saying, some of those things can be offloaded by a person who is not special education certified to provide direct service.
Right.
Like, that's a very specialized skill set that, I mean, it's kind of obvious, but that we need to focus that person in on using that skill set in relationships with their students, where sending notices for PPTs and tracking down email addresses is probably not. Right.
Yeah, so I'm gonna stop because I'm very cognizant of everyone's time, and in the special ed staffing shortages, that is gonna be number one, and I think part of that, we can also say, I love the wording, case management and case loads. I think that we can obviously say that in many places, caseloads are larger than acceptable. And I know that's true because I know teachers, we can't find special ed teachers, so the caseloads are becoming increasingly large. What I would ask of you, because I don't want to delay the writing of the draft report. So we have additional findings from Andy, from Jason, and I think we
CEA.
covered many of them from CEA. But if there's anything in those findings that you are totally a 5 on or a 4, let us know. I think I would like Andy, with your permission, to take a stab at the draft report, given how we were talking about our findings today. I think I would like to do that and then come back on December 12th and ask for changes in that draft report, et cetera. I'm hoping that Andy can have it out some days before the meeting so that you have
That'd be the
time.
plan.
Huh?
That'd be the plan.
Okay, if you could have it out, some days before, so that we can respond to, the report, even in our heads.
So
so
maybe
that
some
we
turkey
come-
stays.
Yeah, when we come to the table, yeah, you could do it on Thanksgiving, yes.
Sorry, just a quick clarification. I noticed it's for the autism guidelines. I know we talked about, they were updated in 2011, not 05. It's just
Okay.
for everyone's,
Okay.
if we are using that.
Okay.
Still under.
We still want to update it. All right, I want to thank you all, and if there's anything you'd like to take with you, please do, and, thank you, I loved the discussion today.
Thanks.
Great.
Thank you for having.
Well, thank you for
Great
your-
discussion.
Right here.
Oh, you do?
And we'll see you December
Wait, I was
12th.
like, oh, I'm close to the rest of the mall.
Yeah.
I'll see you there.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
So the basic conclusion is we need more mandated training.
No.
No, exactly.